I'm getting you just like finish your breath.
So I'm just right here now. But I'm TAing a lot.
Hello, everybody. Oh, good, we have the microphone working. That is great. I'm happy to do the introductions today for our visitor to the Monday Colloquium, Professor Alice Yao. Alice received her PhD from the University of Michigan in 2008. She's an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago. Alice's research has focused on the impact of the Han Empire of China, and particularly on the conquest of frontier regions and the notions of minority and ethnic identity. Her first book, The Ancient Islands of Southwest China, an archaeological history from the Bronze Age to the Han Empire, discussed issues of political incorporation, of gender, of style, and politics. And in the years since that book was published, Alice's work has really moved to a new project. We're doing survey work in Western China, and a whole series of publications about vegetation, climate change, and environmental transformations in that region as well. Most recently, she started a new project that I think is pretty exciting and kind of amazing on the whiteness of milk, and I was delighted that she agreed to come and talk to us about this work in progress. So please join me in welcoming Professor Alice Yao.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you for having me here. This is a project that I sort of started right before the pandemic, and it's been sitting with me, so there have been a lot of developments recently, and I'm hoping that some of you can kind of chime in and help me think through some of the problems that I'm grappling with. So I work in China, and you're probably wondering why I got into milk, and it's partly because my collaborators and I became interested in why we were getting a lot of cattle bones and sheep bones in our sample. We started to think about dairying, and of course, being in East Asia, the assumption is that East Asians can't digest lactose. So I started digging into that a little bit, and this became this this project that just kept growing and snowballing. So I'll just start. Milk has become a sinister substance since the inauguration of Trump, as many of us who lived through that. It circulated widely as a viral symbol of white nationalism at rallies across America. You see alt-right activists chugging milk as a sign of a kind of genetic trait more common in Europeans. For members of the alt-right, dairy milk symbolizes strength of body and society. Drinking it reinforces notions of white superiority and a vision of masculinity. But milk isn't only a cipher for hate. For many minorities in America, it is a symbol of oppression. The imposition of milk as a nutritional food has provided a rallying cause for different groups in the U.S. to sue the USDA's dietary guidelines. And these are two examples in the last 5 years. One brought against USDA by minority physicians in California. And the other one is, I can't remember the specifics, but it's another legal case against this lawsuit against the USDA, and it's been written up in law journals. So I was really struck by how milk, a seemingly benign substance, came to play such a hotly contested role in contemporary America. Until a few years ago, being lactose tolerant or intolerant was really just something you thought about when you went to the grocery store or you waited in line for your coffee. Now, fanning this controversy of this milk is this sort of discovery of a milk gene in archaeology, and especially in archaeogenetics, a new field. And this discovery has now sort of provided evidence for the beginning of dairying and the diffusion of a particular mutation that enables people to, in particular Europeans, to digest lactose, the sugar that's in milk. And even though experts in the hard and soft scientists decry the misuse of science, the ability to digest milk remains a persistent and real biological fact. So my talk today is kind of tracing out the lineage of this kind of research, the emergence of lactose tolerance or intolerance as a scientific object. I examined the whiteness of the dairy gene as a history of an idea, one that began after World War II, and that encompasses the sort of three different phases: the clinical phase, the genomics period, and what's also sometimes referred to as the post-genomics era after 2000. And my interest in this is to kind of understand how cross-disciplinary work began after World War II, and how lactose persistence was sort of part of this larger history in American science, academic cross-disciplinary development. It is an empirically complex story coaxed from cell lines, gas, genes, and artifacts to now big data bites. By examining how messy and confusing this evidence is handled across different fields over this period, I'm sort of trying to understand how the certainty or how the very factness of milk digestion became so important to the sort of public imaginary. And in spite of all the uncertainties, it still somehow has a real grip on our imagination. It's sometimes examined as a European in its geographic origin. Other times the trait is talked about as a multi-geographic adaptation. Sometimes it's under natural selection, other times it's under artificial selection. And for a long time it was thought to be an ancient adaptation, and now it looks like it's more modern. So why is this gene forced to tolerate so many contradictory signals? And how do lactose tolerance or intolerance become settled as a fact? And where will this take us as a matter of concern for a multiracial society? So I'm going to start off by talking about the kind of clinical part. But before I do that, I want to just sort of clarify what exactly is lactose intolerance, clinically speaking. And so we all have this lactase gene, and in our cells in our gut, our lower intestines produces this particular enzyme to digest lactose, the sugar in milk. But for most of us, after infancy, we start to lose that ability. And so that's like the genetic, sort of like, just roughly speaking, how gene function describes this condition. But what it's actually, how it's defined clinically is based on what's called a lactose hydrogen test. This is one of the most widely adopted tests. Basically, you one fast for 8 hours, and then so you're empty stomach, right? And then you take 4 cups of milk. Drink 4 cups of milk, and then there's a measurement of the hydrogen level in your breath, because when lactose isn't digested, that bacteria then settles in and it emits hydrogen. So this is basically the clinical test for the condition. And like the SATs, hydrogen breath test can only tell you so much. It doesn't predict how well you might handle milk. I don't know how many glasses of milk you all drink on a daily basis. I don't drink 4 cups of milk on an empty stomach for sure. So it doesn't tell you how you would handle milk in a normal kind of, like a normal daily consumption. So before the actual discovery of a genetic component associated with lactose, clinical studies in gastroenterology identified that there's a difference between African Americans and whites in the digestion of milk. And this largely came out after World War II, and the USDA was trying to push milk in the global south. They started to notice that there was a difference in the consumption rate of dairy. And then in the 50s and 60s, the U.S. Army field hospitals in the tropical region in Puerto Rico, Army doctors started to notice a difference among white and African American GIs. And so this kind of put the condition on the map as a racial, as a difference in racial expression of a trait. And the USDA started to commission studies, and I sponsored these studies at prisons in Baltimore, where they submitted these tests to African American inmates and white inmates to kind of make this, kind of clarify this racial case study. 10 years later, the study was then published in a series of gut journals, which there's a whole slew of them, gut journals, that about this particular condition. And it's Dr. Tom Bayless, who then, kind of started to map out these differences based on different populations. In the 1960s and 1980s, this professor of geography and anthropology at Berkeley at the time, Frederick Simmons, got a hold of these gut journals and was reading Dr. Bayless's publications avidly. And he started to question, he was trained by Carl Sauer, so this is someone who's really interested in cultural geography, and this is also coming on the foothills of Mary Douglas's work on food taboos. So he was really interested in basically how cultural ideology interacted with dietary preferences. And for him, I mean, I think his intellectual commitments were very much against the kind of mainstream in anthropology at the time, which was cultural, Marvin Harris and Julian Stewart's cultural ecology approach, which sought to explain milk as really, the lack of milk or dairy in societies as a problem of agricultural intensification, that people couldn't really, there's an ecological explanation for why dairy didn't exist in certain parts of the world. And so Frederick Simmons got in this debate with Marvin Harris about this, and he argued instead that that there was an actual cultural and ideological basis to dairying. That primarily it was the people who had a dairying ideology, so in particular in India, that really, set the kind of preference for food preferences. And that cultural ideology or dairying ideology was what allowed people to develop the lactose-tolerant trait. And he then hypothesized that the geography of milking zones, so he kind of mapped out where people aren't able to digest milk, and that's shown in the black, and the white were regions where he thought, he hypothesized people could digest milk. And so going against this kind of cultural ecology in anthropology, he developed the cultural historical hypothesis. But then he made the case that the overlap of dairying ideology and lactose tolerance overlapped with Indo-European languages. And so this was a kind of a returning to an early anthropology and trying to explain Indo-European language, culture, and food practices. Now, bear in mind that at this point, there's actually no known genetic basis for it. They haven't actually figured out where this kind of genetic trait located its precise marker in different populations. There are real problems in Simmons's kind of framing. So he thought Indo-Europeans, right? But there were people who were non-Indo-European speakers who could also digest milk. And so he had real trouble with that. And the one he had a real problem with were the Finns. And I'll talk a little bit about the Finns as a weird population that he had to then sort out. So what followed, so these are the sort of contradictions that he couldn't really quite grapple with. There are people who, who are lactose persistent. They can produce this lactase, but they're not Indo-European speakers. And there are also Indo-Europeans who do not dairy. And he sort of, had all these anomalies that he couldn't quite answer at the point. But what followed then after his cultural historical hypothesis was put out there was that gastroenterologists started to undertake a global study of lactase persistence percentages across different populations on the globe. And as you can see here, this is the kind of percentage presentation. Lactase non-persistence is very low in European populations. So you see UK white, Finland, Central Italy, Irish, Danes, and Swedes. So there's a difference in the geographic distribution of this particular trait. So in the 1980s, this is all before mass PCR sequencing was widely available or developed. The first step was really trying to figure out if there was a genetic basis, an inherited basis to this trait. And this was again undertaken in clinical setting, and strangely in Finland, the place where there's a real problem between the Indo-European and non-Indo-European speaker. And so what they did was they went and picked out a sample size of Finnish families where they could trace parent and offspring relations and figure out, if parents lactase persistent, parents also produce lactase persistent offspring. And they were able to this kind of large scale study in Finland and also in Britain, determine that there was a connection there between parent and offspring, ability to digest milk. But as I want to show later is that the Finns made the coherence kind of European as a population somewhat problematic. And also Simond's work in its incorporation into these gastro studies also sort of kept the Indo-European as a category on the burner, right? So it's back there and it's sitting there. So let me chart a little more specifically the emergence of dairy digestion in this early part of the genomic kind of era, and eventually how archaeology gets pulled in here. So in the early genomic era, a gene was considered a functional unit, and this is a kind of diagram that shows the shift after the, at the beginning of the 80s and 90s. And so we're all sort of used to this idea, or taught in high school, that there's a genotype and a phenotype, and there's this direct relationship. But during this sort of new period, the gene was kind of shifting the identity of the gene was shifting ground. There's no longer kind of a gene for idea, rather the gene was slowly becoming an interactive unit, where advancements in gene sequencing generated a paradigm shift to sort of approach the gene as a systemic entity. And it was rather this idea that a gene had a kind of, there are many sequences acting multiple pathways, which led to its transcription of proteins. And this bottom diagram is to kind of show you that, so around each gene there are certain sequences surrounding the gene that are what's called the enhancer and promoters. And the enhancers, sort of loci, basically help the regulation downstream of that particular genetic expression, so lactase. So what the initial studies were trying to do, they were trying to figure out which loci within the enhancer and promoter region were responsible for turning or kicking up activating that transcription activity downstream. And this is, a very laborious kind of project, because you've got to kind of like figure out which one is going to kind of trigger the general expression of lactase downstream. And so the microbiologists got on this, and then also pathologists. There was a lot of sampling of intestinal cell lines. By the mid-1990s, Finns, like a study again in Finland, started to show that there was definitely some kind of association between this promoter region and the expression downstream, but it wasn't definitive, right? So it wasn't really clear which one was doing what. And so it was really tricky, and they weren't able to pinpoint this down specifically. In 2002, this large-scale study, a collaborative study, again on British and Finnish populations, started to kind of come in closer to this narrow region that they thought was sort of associated with the expression of lactase gene, but it wasn't in the lactase gene. It was actually like tens of thousands. I think it was like 14,000 base pairs away in a different gene called the MCM9 gene or MCM6 gene. And so they did this by looking at Finnish lactase persistence in individuals and slowly kind of zeroing in on these individuals and where their particular markers in that kind of region were, could be established as homologous across all of these individuals. And what they discovered was this one particular SNP. A SNP is a single nucleotide polymorphism. It's just basically a position in a genome where some people have one nucleotide and others have another. So there are different variants in these locations. And they figured out that it was this one particular SNP in European populations called the LCT13910, and whether you had a base pair of a thymine or cytosine that really made the difference in the regulation and kicking up that LCT promoter. But what was really interesting with this study was that they discovered that this is not your classic Mendelian trait. This is actually a continuous trait. It's not whether you're lactose intolerant or tolerant. There are people who have, as you can see, a CT combination, allele combination, where basically you're heterozygote. And for those heterozygotes, they can still digest some lactose, right? So they're in this intermediate category of so-called tolerance. So this is not turning out to be like a binary trait in the classic kind of Mendelian sense. And one would think that this would kind of change our thinking around lactose intolerance as a condition, but it didn't. It just, this is kind of tabled for the time being. And I think Simmons actually suggested that all those lactose intolerant, those intermediate group, were Finns who had mixed with Swedish speakers. They were the weird Finns that was giving you this kind of pattern. And then, so this is a kind of graph showing the distribution or the prevalence of this particular trait among European populations. And I mean, what you can see from here, the sorting of populations is along Klein, a geographic latitudinal gradient, from Swedes to the southern end of southeastern end of Europe to Turks. But again, what's interesting is that the Swedish and Finnish speakers are separated as two distinct groups, and this is partly because they were really trying to figure out, what I guess I'm implying here is the Indo-European is still in this graph, even though clinicians and geneticists are very careful about how to use that term in their publications. And so if you can imagine, if you were to put the Finnish speakers back and the Swedish speakers, it wouldn't really change this graph all that much, actually. But there's something about the Finns that kind of have to sort them out from the pile. And so here is a weird convergence of both latitudinal geographic difference and cultural difference they don't really converge in this graph, but the graph is showing you that kind of dynamic is sitting there in people's minds. So this was happening in 2003, so 3 years prior. This is like a Hail Mary moment in American science, right? The completion of the Human Genome Project. And Bill Clinton is there in sort of a celebratory speech with Francis Collin and Craig Venter, who were behind this kind of big project of mapping the first genome. And Craig Venter, who's somewhat of a character, said, I believe, well, he's also the one behind a lot of this forensic DNA stuff, commercialization of forensic DNA applications. So he said, I believe one of the great truths to emerge from this triumphant expedition inside the human genome is that in genetic terms, all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99.9% the same. So now he's put it out there in the sort of public sphere that there's a 0.01% of difference, really, that we should be thinking about, or in so minuscule, we should kind of consider race as having no scientific basis. So this is just, again, a map of the distribution of that particular mutation, the European mutation. And you can see the high prevalence. This is a map that was published in 2003 showing this distribution. And this is picked up, this study on the lactase gene was picked up widely, right, including among alt-right members of Stormfront. So Stormfront is an alt-right website, and you can track the threads on this website on various topics. There's subgroups within this site. And so I just did a basic search going back to 2003 on lactase persistence, and this is what pulled up these long, actually the thread runs for 5 years continuously. And so what you can see here, so John Joy Tree, so I just pulled out, he quotes directly from the Nature Genetics publication. And he says, if a genetic feature is found around the world, genetics tells us that it must be very old, perhaps before modern humans differentiated into geographic races. So before there's race, if this gene is already out there, what does that mean? He's throwing it out there as a question to all the other users. And then there's this response by this guy named Cold Star. And Cold Star basically says it doesn't matter if it's pre-race, before there's race. He says the mutants carrying the gene must have enjoyed a survival advantage. Such lactose tolerance, as it turns out, is most common among people of Northern European descent. It was in the northern climes, with one harvest a year, where such people would have found survival advantage in their year-round nutrition of dairy. So he's kind of saying that this mutation is something that we really need to think about in terms of tracking what it means to be white. And this is coming at a time when, Craig Venter and, public health is pushing this idea of there's no genetic difference among races. So these minuscule differences have taken on a new kind of political reality in terms of the identitarian politics in the US and the post-genomics era. And 2003 was also the same year that NIH dropped Caucasian as a viable scientific category. So here there's there's a big void around the category white. So 4 years after the European gene mutation was identified, geneticists, actually Sarah Tishkov, who's here at Penn, I think in the medical school, discovered 4 other mutations in Africa. In particular, her study surveyed something like, sequenced something like cell samples from 42 ethnic groups. And what she found was that in particular there were 4 different variants, and some of these variants also overlapped with pastoralists in East Africa. So again, there seemed to be a good case for a connection between dairying as a cultural practice and the evolution of this particular genetic trait. And there were something like 5 variants, and she documented their prevalence across different populations. And this discovery was hailed by the sort of geneticists as a major one, right? Because the bottom quote is by Sigrun Bonn, who are, I think they're geneticists who have spent many years researching this. They describe this as a beautiful illustration of regulatory convergent evolution, in which nearby variants underline the same phenotypic change arose in different populations. Such a parallel increase of multiple alleles in different areas clearly suggests the action of natural selection. And Sarah Tishkov also herself said this is an excellent example of ongoing adaptation in humans and the co-evolution of genes and culture. And what they're all getting at with these African variants is that they have here something that would kind of validate this kind of heavily debated issue in evolutionary ecology, which is something that's called co-evolution or convergent evolution. And there's been quite a bit written about this, so sometimes people will talk about it as Darwin's unfinished symphony. So Darwin talked a lot about natural selection, but his last work was on the evolution of culture, the selection of culture. And so these variants in Africa kind of opened the door to this new paradigm, a kind of a paradigm shift within ecology and evolution. And so there's other kind of stakes here, right? So it's what is worth thinking about is one, evolution is working to generate a kind of shared biological condition across diversity. And this family resemblance or this implications are that, in some ways it's a reframing of evolution and the causality, reworking the causality of evolution from natural selection to the input of culture. And this new finding from Africa is kind of pointing us in that direction. so the forces here, what's being kind of thrown out there is that the forces of biological heritability, rather than essentializing differences, which now kind of has potential to kind of help us think through human commonality. And if Troy Duster, who's a sociologist of race, he said, if any of you of life through a prism of heritability can reinvigorate race thinking, he was really worried about what was going on in genetics. And the sort of genetics people working on this are saying, now we can think about convergent evolution. And there's different compelling narrative here to think about the role of culture, right? And bypass this horrible problem of heritability that sort of haunted us. Because now we can, a strong version of this is something like culture is co-directing evolution. So there are other issues here, which I think Sarah Tishkoff also acknowledged, which is that this is not a clear-cut picture of the African variant in terms of co-evolution, because there were groups like the Dinka and the Newers, or classics in anthropology, who are known to be pastoralists, but also have very low levels of lactase persistence. So the genotype and phenotype kind of association was not exactly clear-cut, so these are kind of inconsistencies. Now, that didn't really kind of enter the public kind of debate. People who were involved in these conversations would say, okay, well, you can bypass that problem by making cheese or yogurt, which reduces the lactose content. So in certain pastoral groups, they may not be milk drinkers. Unfortunately, that argument only then put out there that there are real milk drinkers and not real milk drinkers. People who dairy but aren't really milk drinkers. So the question now became, who are the real milk drinkers? And the only way to figure that out was to find it in the past, right? To kind of determine, well, one, you have populations who you can look at in the modern context, but you kind of have to see selection in action by going into the deep past. So as nice as this kind of co-evolution kind of paradigm seemed to kind of move things, move the conversation, redirect genetics in new ways, there was still this problem of when the selection and who the real milk drinkers are. At the same time this conversation is going on, so this is the most recent mapping of all these different variants across the world. So it's updated to show the African variants here. This is just, I think, 2020's fairly recent kind of mapping of this distribution, global distribution. So the question was, okay, so how does one find selection in action and locate those original milk drinkers? And archaeologists during this period, 2009, there's a significant sort of advancement in archaeochemistry where the ability to use residue analysis from pottery sherds and figure out lipid profiles, right? That could then kind of distinguish milk from other fatty substances. So archaeologists knew that at this point that milk was somehow dairying came into Europe in the Neolithic, and it was thought to be the mass migration of farmers from the Near East who brought this sort of package into Europe. And so they kind of said, oh, here's a potential opportunity to kind of validate this hypothesis, the co-evolution hypothesis. And then this is also at the start of the developing kind of formative period of archaeogenetics. So they were looking in some ways to find the kind of missing link to this picture. And first they start sampling human remains and looking for potentials in this heavily decayed. So this is a very tricky endeavor to kind of extract ancient DNA. The Lecce project was a European project funded by the Marie Curie Foundation. This is a $5 million project to try and figure out what happened with milking in the archaeological record. So this is scaled up to a matter of public concern in Europe at a time when the dairy industry was also waning in Europe. So the first kind of run of this hypothesis was they first had to figure out through simulation roughly when the kind of selection, when this kind of genetic adaptation might have emerged. And this was done through very complicated simulation, population genetics, where they kind of said, okay, you have all these different Neolithic cultures in Europe, and you have a bunch of radiocarbon dates. And so they kind of developed this framework where they would simulate a number of hunter-gatherers, farmers, and if you modify the different population thresholds and you know include different selection pressures, what kind of probability time frame can one start to look for the emergence of this particular trait? And what they pinned down was this relative kind of window, 6,256 to 8,683 BP, and that period was connected with a widespread phenomenon in Europe called the linear beaker culture. And so they zoned in on collecting human remains associated with that particular culture, but were not entirely, they weren't able to find that particular lactase gene in that human remain sample. And then in 2015, this is two separate studies on ancient DNA, and these two groups collected samples across that whole kind of temporal span from the Neolithic all the way to the Bronze Age, and they were able to sequence all of these individuals and extract pretty good sequences from these. Both these are two different samples, and both these studies converged on one finding, which was that there was a big sort of shift in the population structure in the Bronze Age, about 3,700 to 2,000 BC. And this shift in population structure was associated with the introduction of let me just see here. Right. So the migration of a culture known as the Yamnaya from the Caucasus across Europe began to show up in the genetic structure of ancient populations. So this is just a kind of, the Yamnaya ancestry is shown in orange, and you're looking at the bottom graph of the ancient sample there. So you can see there's from EN is early Neolithic, middle Neolithic up to late Bronze Age. And what they pointed out was that yes, Europe is all mixed up, right? It's a mix of different ancestries of Near Eastern ancestry associated with the Neolithic, this original kind of hunter-gatherer population, and also the most recent one, which was the steppe culture called the Yamnaya. And these Yamnaya are associated with horses and chariots. If you look at the corded ware population there, subpopulation in that sample, that was where they picked up the most kind of, the highest contribution of steppe ancestry to a European population. And then they found the lactase gene in the Yamnaya, and they started to pick up variants of that in the Bronze Age corded ware culture. The frequency, I'll show you in a sec, was quite low. But what they wanted to kind of emphasize was that Europe is a mixture of different populations. So there's no pure European kind of genetic group or genetic ancestry to speak of. But what they also introduced inadvertently is this return of the migration as a kind of, as a force, right? As a kind of cultural phenomenon. And you can imagine when migration is a kind of a virulent topic in European politics, what this kind of study then kind of became very, very contentious. And they also, whereas before the Indo-European, Simone's Indo-European had really been on the sidelines or gatekept, I think. Now in these two studies, the Indo-Europeans came back to the picture because of the tracing of ancestry to the steppes. these two studies made the case that here they also have proof of the spread of Indo-European languages, along with daring and horses and the whole package. The two studies also tried to focus on what they call SNPs of kind of under high selection. So they also wanted to look at, in addition to lactase, they were interested in SNPs involved in melatonin production. And so here you see two other SNPs, one tied to skin pigmentation and blue eyes. And if you look at the ancient graph, the frequency in the ancient graph, you'll notice that actually lactase levels are quite low. It's present, but it is not at a frequency one would expect in what you see in modern day populations. So one of the concerns was, wow, again, like you see the pair of skin pigmentation, blue eyes there, it throws up all sorts of flags. But what they were interested in was that this is an adaptation to latitude, right? So you would expect to see vitamin D deficiency being a problem that somehow the melatonin gene would be selected for, in addition with lactase, the ability to digest. So these would somehow all converge. But a lot of genetic work has been done to show that melatonin is a very complex trait. It's actually under the influence of multiple different genetic kind of components, right? It's not just like one gene turns it on and off. So this is one of the problems that was identified with this study. Another thing that came out of this work was that both groups were able to sample what's known as the haplogroup type. On your Y chromosome, there's these long chains that remain intact on the Y chromosome. And so this one particular one that they sequenced out of the Yamnaya group, shown in there, the Copper Age, is this R1b haplogroup. And it traces supposedly your paternal ancestry. And so again, they showed that the R1b rate increases in the Bronze Age, and by in contemporary European populations, it's quite high. So this particular, these studies were picked up again in that same thread on Stormfront in 2015 and 16. This is just an exchange between two users, and where they're sussing out which haplogroup is a definitive marker of being white. So there's a map that was then sort of pasted on in this thread, and it's a map of race in Europe from the Nazi era, and it shows the different races distribution. And what this bioboy is trying to do is to make the case that these R1b, these groups defined out of these two archaeogenetic studies, can be mapped onto these racial groups. And so some of these kind of exchanges here, I just cut and pasted from that thread. LP gave Indo-European pastoralists an edge in terms of reproductive fitness, greater health and vigor, better multipliers, more successfully defend their families against others. So, this is coming at the same time that people using that milk meme during the sort of early, before Trump was elected. So this is all kind of caballing into this one big public, round. It was kind of creating a new public, I think, from out of scientific literature and public citizen kind of consumption of this science. So after this, it became kind of apparent that the LP genetic variant had morphed into something else altogether. It wasn't really just about defining convergent evolution or the conditions for the convergent evolution. But here the collaboration and input of archaeologists had turned it into the factness of Indo-European as a fact to be sort of made open to analysis. Of course, a well-spoken geneticist acknowledged, tragically, this debate figured heavily in racist politics in the science of 19th and early 20th centuries Europe. But hopefully we can move on from the past, he said. And because after all, they've shown that Europeans were all mixed up from the get-go, from early and prehistory. And this sort of speaks to, in some ways, what Dwana Fawiley, who's a medical anthropologist, have talked about the molecularization of race. But here, this is, among Anglo-European groups, where this is also kind of becoming a very viral, but also, I think, underexplored dimension here. And in part because of direct-to-consumer packages that are now available. And I'll show you a slide from that. So the STIP markers that I talked about, all these markers that came out of archaeogenetics is now in the public domain. So it's been added to biobanks, and this is just something that I've been trying to track. It's this company called Genome Link, and they somehow have access to all of this newly published ancient DNA material, and you can feed your 23andMe ancestry into this, and it will run your ancestry assessments for you. And so you can see, are you a first farmer or a steppe pastoralist? I mean, we laugh at this, but I think what's really kind of something to think about is that for most people, ancestry is continental origins, even in these direct-to-consumer packages. They're East Asian, South Asian, and Indigenous Americans, right? So those are still the continental origins that we typically, or population genetics works with. But for white Europeans now, the identity is tied to something else, something different, right? It's a certain kind of fine-tuning of whiteness based on a prehistoric kind of profile. And it's sort of telling us something, I think, about the shifting boundaries of whiteness that's emerging out of the collaboration of archaeologists and geneticists, because all of this is, biobank data now. So what I'm just going to conclude. What I'm trying to show with this talk is, in some ways, a story of collaboration or interdisciplinarity, where there's like new research partnerships after World War II, and this is what was envisioned and all the money thrown into building up American sort of science, right, and academia. So it's become progressively more interdisciplinary, but yet there's a lot of inconsistencies in that interdisciplinary that never get worked out, or are somehow reduced and lowered in importance as we move across the discipline. Because something about lactase persistence there's something about it that needs to, its very factness is somehow really important to, I think, a kind of a social and racial reality in so-called post-genomic and our post-racial futures. So some of these inconsistencies I'll just mention briefly. For Frederick Simmons, lactase persistence was an Indo-European trait, but the Finns were a problem for him, and he never really quite figured out how to kind of explain away the Finns who were not Indo-European speakers. And you saw how that kind of translated into the early genomic population studies, where the Finns were split up. And when this, even, after people who picked up Simmons, and a lot of the geneticists and gastro studies were actually cited Simmons as a source of inspiration. And even though they adopted his ideas, they kind of overlooked that lactose tolerance is not a either or binary state, right? There are a lot of people who are heterozygotes and still can digest lactose, but that somehow is also managed as an uncertainty. And I'm not quite sure how that's managed. And there's also this discovery of the multiple mutations in Africa. It seemed to kind of promise a new way to think about evolution, and update culture's role in that kind of theory. But each time this kind of new research partner gets kind of thrown in there, this project, lactase persistent trait, takes on a new urgency. All of these kind of inconsistencies become really unwieldy to manage, and sometimes they reappear, and it becomes a problem that remains unresolved. But that also can be managed, and I think what I'm trying to sort of figure out is what goes into that management of inconsistency. I like the idea of co-evolution and that kind of different outlook and who's going to argue with Darwin's Unfinished Symphony, right? It's great. And this is comes at a time when it seemed like it's really valuable to society. But in the wake of this post-genomic era, where we're told that there's no scientific basis for race and that we are all 99.9% alike, that 0.01% of difference takes on a tantamount significance. Archaeologists have, I think, somehow unwittingly mainstreamed the Indo-European in this recent addition to the transdisciplinary project here. So one can look at this and come up with critiques, and I'm thinking about this in a kind of self-reflective mode, and you can probably sense the critique throughout my talk. And so I like to kind of go back to look towards classic essay where this is about face. The essay is called "Why Critique Has Run Out of Steam." And he says, all of you social scientists, you take two kinds of critical positions, the fact or the fairy position, and I think I've taken both in this paper. So the fairy criticism chalks up racial virulent symbols of milk to, alt-right people practicing pseudoscience. They're just this popular misappropriation of science. So that's kind of like what he calls the fairy position. To me, that seems kind of a naive and inadequate critique. The other is the fact position, which is a critique aimed at debunking the facts. So me as a social scientist, pointing at scientists for constructing hard, durable facts, and then going about and debunking it for all its false assumptions. So again, when I brought up the milk digestion as there's an intermediary digester, heterozygote, why is that not taken up as an invitation for analysis? But that to me also seems kind of inadequate to the reality confronting us at the moment. So in the case of lactase persistence, I hope that maybe to work with just how squishy this idea is may get at some of the ways that differences and uncertainties get managed and what is happening there in that space of management. To criticize scientists for mistaken facts, I think, is to walk away feeling self-gratified, and that's not what I'm trying to do here, because it doesn't really help us think about the problems of racial identity. European archaeologists actually have already done the critique, so I'm like, okay, I'm not going to add to that critique. And some of my colleagues at Chicago have called this racecraft. But by calling it racecraft, scientists as conjurers of magic. I don't know, it's in some ways turning away from the logics in which people from scientists to consumers are really part of the same public, and we're all kind of living out this identity in the post-genomics era, in this very uneven kind of landscape, terrain of what does it mean to have an identity. So I guess what I'm saying is either the fact or fairy position will push us to understand what kinds of difference will matter or will be the deciding factors in sort of matters of racial identity. And I think Paul Robinow coined this biosociality term in the early 90s. It's very prophetic, where he says, genetics, it's going to change how we think about collective identity. Our collective identities are going to be driven by a specific biomedical condition, right? And this kind of genome link thing I think is kind of alluding to that kind of what those collective formations mostly happening in virtual space. Looking at this, I'm trying to think about what lactase persistence, like this particular study of the history of an idea and where it is now is kind of getting to this problem of what is the coming we in the near future. And in particular, as archaeologists and archaeogenetics grow as a field, I think those ancestry groups are going to start to look quite different than the continental origin types that we have right now. Thank you. Yep. Sorry, you in the far left, next to the yaks. Oh, I guess you're right at the end of the row of yaks.
Thank you so much. That was really incredible. I have a question about these two sort of metasemiotic terms, tolerance and intolerance. So I'm wondering about tolerance as also something that organizes difference, and when that comes up historically. So intolerance, like lactose intolerance, is something that arises in this archive that you're tracing. I'm wondering about tolerance as the implicit baseline through which intolerance, is measured. But then I'm wondering if tolerance emerges as an effective mapping intolerance, etc. And then the other thing sort of just doesn't have to do with that, but your point about of sort of tracing these racial ideologies in relationship to language. I couldn't help but think about the sort of nationalist discourses around mother tongue, and then the ways in which that potentially links to breast milk.
Oh man,
I was just curious if that ever comes up. It might not have anything to do with what you just.
No, it does.
Here, but
I think there is an implicit gender politics under some of this, at least in these sort of threads on Stormfront. Milk versus breast milk, a feminine substance and a masculine substance. So I think it's like cutting into this other kind of gender plane, so that it's like racializing gender too. And it's something that I think it'd be really interesting to look at the European blogs and see how that is then tied into or registers different tongues in the language, and how that kind of becomes a way to also rationalize different kinds of language, different premiums of language. And because certainly language ideology is one of the big things, right? I can't help but shake the feeling that this is like mapping onto a lot of different.
absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. And on the tolerance and intolerance, that's really helpful. I actually been trying to get into the NIH archives to figure out when this kind of first emerged in actual clinical notes. And I don't know where the labels come from. So it was actually called lactose malabsorption, which is like so clinically neutral, right? But then it shifts and becomes something called lactose tolerance and intolerance.
It's a very fascinating thing because it's also those terms are known outside of this discourse of post-genomics. They're also known in multicultural discourse, like tolerance, which is another way of framing difference with respect to the nation state.
In a multiracial state. So at what point
they emerged at similar moments?
I think it has to come. I'm just guessing, right? I think there's a big push in the NIH sometime in the post-war era where there has to be a kind of accommodation for a scientific language that tolerates something. And I'm not sure. I kind of have an idea that maybe it comes out of changes in the NIH because there was also a UN charter, right? I think in the 40s that talked about how there's no such thing, and so there is this kind of, oh man, I wonder if I should even think about looking at like civil rights era legal cases.
The archive expands.
Yeah, I know. I was trying desperately to get into the NIH, and trying to find Frederick Simlins. He becomes like a consultant for Stanford Medical, and this is like racial politics in the 60s and 70s in California is really interesting too, right? So he becomes like involved in that in California and the proposition that came up in California. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to comment on a few of the points here as a way of helping guide some of the exploration of literature and research.
Okay, that'd be great.
The first is just the point about tolerance and intolerance. I think that came to some extent out of trying to develop nutritional guidelines for consumption of those vitamin D and things of this kind, but it used Europeans as a reference point as what is sort of normal or what is the standard. Anyone who was not tolerant or was then considered to be somehow unhealthy. And that language changed from tolerance and intolerance to persistence, actually echoing the malabsorption language. Once it was realized that it was problematic and most people in the world are not, technically speaking, lactose tolerant. So we might explore that angle within the NIH history and research. The issue about Indo-European language, I think, is one that could also be explored quite productively through the lens of historic linguistics. Since that has influenced many archaeologists who are diving into this, and even now remains a contested idea as to where were the first Indo-Europeans. And this gets into some interesting entangled literature because how genes map and how languages map may not be the same. And you can have the spread of persistence of the hypothetically and have them be unrelated to the languages that later spread across the same area. So even this becomes further complicated once you add those kinds of research into the story. The story of the Europeans is still not, even though I think you rightly point out becomes sort of becomes an issue on which people want to plant a flag as to having solved the problem, but I don't actually think we're there. I think all this information does is make it more complicated.
I think it's super complicated. One of the critiques that, European archaeologists have also made is that you can't map pots onto language, onto culture, and that depending on what time slice you're looking at in that corded ware culture, some of that corded ware stuff looks just like the steppe material. So you're probably, looking at the same population or subpopulation moving around. So that is a kind of empirical issue that I think a lot of European archaeologists have taken. They've written a lot about this. But it hasn't changed the beat of the drum. So there's another article that just came out where, the persistence of this Indo-European kind of heritage one just has to, it's already there, right? And one just has to kind of identify a stronger selective pressure in the archaeological data to verify it. So I'm not sure why there's this clinging on to this Indo-Europeanness that is driving or that is central to a lot of these big nature articles.
Well, it may be partly because some people who are writing them are population geneticists and not anthropologists. So there's some need for those research teams to also perhaps dive into the literature a little bit, delve into it a bit further.
For somebody who worked with archaeogenetics, I'd be able to speak what that experience is like.
Yeah, I do this kind of research. So a couple other points which I think are also, and then I'll stop. There's a lot to talk about in this regard. The thing is, the point you made about trying to trace concurrence with alleles for lactase persistence, and specifically the one that you find commonly in people of European geographic descent. And skin color and eye color and so forth is is one that I think is underappreciated for its complexity too. The reason for the attempt to understand it is a hypothesis of lighter skin color and other latitudes being supported with the dietary supplementation of vitamin D for milk. And the concurrence of the timing of those variants may not be exactly the same. And the same thing is true for blonde hair and blue eyes. I mean, blue eyes are thought to have originated in the Balkans.
Yeah.
And then later spread in other places, whereas light skin color and all the variants for this, for blonde hair, are much more Northern European in origin. So even the phenotypes that are attempted to link to lactase persistence are complicated in themselves and don't align exactly within a geographic or temporal perspectives. So I think that's would be a fruitful avenue to explore further.
Yeah, so I'm guessing you're a geneticist. And yeah, I don't, so I'm taking a genetics course right now, and now skin color and eye color is such a complicated trait. But so like given that, right, given knowing that, it's, I think it's all I often talk about as a continuous trait. And a classic example to sort of, to get undergrads to not think in this Mendelian mode. But it comes, I'm not quite sure why when they look for SNPs in these archaeogenetic studies, they target those along with the lactase. So those four, and stature actually gets lumped in sometimes.
That's problematic because there are hundreds of genes that influence stature.
Yeah, exactly.
But the reason for that is because stature varies across Europe since over the last 25,000, 30,000 years. Tall people replaced by short people, replaced by tall people, and many people. And Europeans are not homogeneous, so that's why there's interest in looking at variants conferring aspects of that phenotype in terms of stature. So we can talk later, but I wanted to mention you keep raising the questions of the problematic fins. And are you familiar with the background of fins and their genetic ancestry?
Yeah, some of them trace their ancestry to indigenous people, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
From Aboriginal Siberians in that area and all the Arabic-speaking groups.
Right.
So the Finns of Northern Europe, even before you have the sweep of the Yamnaya people, you have others moving into deglaciated Europe and mixing up there in Northern Europe, including those that were giving rise to modern-day Finns. So that complexity, and then the expansion of other people bringing genes north, adds to this dynamic, which you have to tease out and explain as to the influence why you see these other kinds of alleles linked to popular phenotypes of choice.
Yeah, so fins are... So, okay, I see the complexity there in that subpopulation, but it still strikes me when you start splitting Finns by language, whether they're Finnish speaking or Swedish speaking, and in these population genetic studies, I'm not quite certain what the rationale there is. I think I know what the rationale is. It's that there should be considered different subpopulations.
Well, you see, even within Scandinavia, the populations still speaks Uralic languages of the Sami. The Sami live across all three Scandinavian countries. Some Sami speak Swedish, some Sami speak Norwegian, some are bilingual. Sami and Finland, they speak Finnish and Sami. So, but the degree of mixture varies in each of those places, and that could have some sort of calibration or some influence on the relative frequency of lactase persistence you see across all those Scandinavian countries. So even trying to consider Finns as a subpopulation, I don't know, there's complexity. So just as you're getting at, there's no European genome there, in the same way, even within a country, given this complex history, there's no one Finn.
Yeah.
You're defining a single nation state as modern manifestation. So,
yeah.
Anyway, I'll stop.
No, yeah, Deb.
No, I think just to follow up on that, I think what makes the language question so interesting actually is this sort of old ideology around nation state formation, right? Around putting together race, language, culture. And it seems to me that the persistence of the language differentiations in a study setting are emerging from that kind of ideological bias that links race with language and sort of wants to make those kinds of differentiations and to link them to kind of, a racial basis as well, in order to sort of think through those evolutionary models and also those hierarchies. I mean, that's what was striking to me when you were talking it through language rather than through sort of migration.
Yeah. I'm also wondering, like, the nation state as a confounding problem for geneticists. Maybe you can speak more to that, like how that is handled in all its ambiguity in relation to biology.
How old are nation states? A few centuries?
Very recent.
Maybe more. At least empire, boundaries of empires. Compared to the settlement of those areas, which is thousands and thousands of years old, laying the basic patterns we see today, not including modern migrations. But so I mean, if you try to think about populations in terms of national boundaries, that may confuse some aspects of history of the people living within that space.
Yeah, and I didn't mean it as actually existing nation states. I just meant it as the ideology that would frame the question, a research question.
Say,
That kind of model. Go ahead.
sorry, I'd say drilling down on that. So when you talk about Yamnaya many times, you use as shorthand, they're from the Caucasus. And obviously the Yamnaya are not really from the Caucasus, right? Like, they're much better represented. I mean, you know this, right? Because you've done, this is kind of part of your world, so.
I still can't quite figure out what the Yamnaya are.
Sure, no one knows what the Yamnaya are, but they're much better defined, not in the Northern Caucasus, but in, like, Western Kazakhstan. And, kind of the area of the Urals. So again, there's an interesting slippage there, which I wonder if, which of course comes through your talk, but I suspect comes through your talk only because the people that you're reading are doing this as well.
Yeah, because that's where the samples are from, and they I think in one of those 2015 nature studies, they get a lot of those samples from the near Caucasus area, and so then that's a geographic identifier of Indo-European. I don't remember the historical linguistics and how that's kind of how historical linguistics even pinpoints that as an origin of Indo-European languages. But I get the sense that they're trying to find samples that are going to bring them close to that kind of location. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I just want to reiterate again, thank you so much for this amazing talk. I'm going to be thinking about this all week, and you've given us to think with. So thank you. One question I have is a little bit going back to this the question of gender. One thing I'm noticing that you're on the screen right now is this kind of this like image of the Vikings, and that's what I think of when I think of like contemporary whiteness. It's kind of being, imagined and brought together with historical data. But when I think of dairying, and you mentioned dairying also as an ideology, which I feel like is a sub-question of the question I'm going to ask, which is like, it also implies sort of a lifestyle that I imagine is quite different than other ways of imagining whiteness. I mean, like, what I feel like I know about this is that I think people really, especially like, there's like a masculinity about the Viking sort of historical identity, which feels really opposite to what might be considered a quote-unquote dairying ideology. So I'm wondering if you could talk about kind of pastoralism and like how is that contrary to or folded up with this sort of whiteness as conquest idea? Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, so the Vikings and the steppe, the pastoralists are all kind of, feed into that masculine ideology of conquest, right? These are guys, the Yamnaya are associated with horse riding and chariots, and so they're considered a kind of very martial, and kind of character. I think one of the geneticists used the term the Eastern Cowboys to describe the Yamnaya, and Vikings too are, kind of reified this conquest persona. But why I think these two kind of groups are sort of so compelling as a narrative for people, especially for alt-right individuals, is that there's been some work done by sociologists in the way that white nationalists are trying to reclaim biodiversity or diversity within their understanding of white identities. So the way something like the steppe and Vikings become important in that kind of claim making is it introduces this possibility that there is diversity within whites and that there are certain kinds of whites that are more exotic. And so that's how some of this is being read and absorbed. I don't know if that kind of addresses your question.
Yeah, well, I guess like part of what I'm thinking about is wondering if there's sort of a feminization of dairy. Like, because I think about in Europe, the idea of like who was doing dairy farming is often women. And so I'm just wondering about how that gets folded into the idea of what it says. I think often to me seems really clear as
I don't think, the milk, the sort of focus on milk is on the ingestion of milk, drinking the milk. There's never, milking as an activity, you're right, is kind of glossed oftentimes in a kind of gendered domestic mode of production. But pastoralism in general, I don't know, Emily, maybe you can kind of tack on the kind of the way it is narrated in Central Asian or Russian studies. My understanding is milking and dairying, it's just these two aren't divided as activities, as sort of like social activities. Like it's just they're kind of they're one thing, right? But for some reason, that's not, milking itself is never, it's not indexical of something else. Is that, and maybe Lauren,
It's not always a female activity ethnographically. For example, some North African mobile pastoralists, milking itself is a male activity, but the processing of milk is sometimes a female activity. So it depends, it's not consistent.
But milking in the popular imagination, I
I
totally get, yeah.
Exactly, in popular imagination is,
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a
sorry.
question. So does someone else? Jake,
Yeah.
you wanna go?
You had a question?
Okay, sure. Thank you so much. My question is kind of just maybe thinking like to the end point of one of these lines of questions about like also thinking about the cows, and like I know that like not like the cows, but like I know that there's like actual like now like heritage breeding of cows.
Oh, you kind of hit the nail on that. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's like a lot of discussion now about like cows that produce certain kinds of hormones even that like trigger lactose intolerance or don't trigger lactose intolerance. And like when you go to a farmer's market, like you can buy like milk that has like this milk now has this hormone, which is like an ancient hormone that dates back to when this cow was imported from Europe. And I guess I'm just thinking about like in your presentation, if there's a way to go further with the food consumption angle a little bit and draw some connections to what we're seeing like with like this GenoLink database and how there's like this parallel like genomic industry of food that's building up. And like I can imagine, like you're talking about surfacing kind of what the future like ethnic identities that people will be kind of rallying around, how they're changing. I also think that's like going to very much be reflected in the kinds of foods that people are consuming, and like within white supremacy, there's always like these, kind of like outlying threads of like we're gonna, will do like a keto diet, or
Oh, yeah.
you know what I mean? Like there's this whole other kind of like parallel world of the consuming, and I think that came up at the beginning of your talk as important to like this imposition of a certain diet that was done for commercial needs, but or like driven by marketing. But I also wonder like how much that is also driven by this kind of like racialized thinking.
Yeah, so if you actually pay Genome Link, they give you a wellness profile based on your particular heritage. So yeah, but I think what you asked is really important, right? So there's this kind of bias toward cows and cows and cows. And what about, other kinds of, I think there could be a more interesting story to tell, at least from ancient genetics perspective, to think about why drink milk from certain animals, because they also have sheep and goats on top of cows, right? And we know that sheep and goat milk have lower levels of lactose, and the protein molecules are actually, the peptides are actually differently formulated, they're different in those two breeds, and they're actually they're easier to digest, break down than, we only drink, I think, Holstein and Jersey. I think those are the two main breeds, right? So there's this kind of, I think, an interesting story there to think about is, dairying is a cross-species kind of relationship. But I'm not sure if people are that interested in that problem per se, right? If you can, as you're thinking along as this might be commercialized or marketable, I'm sure they would, that then would become a research topic in no time. So
who's buying the milk that has the different, that you're talking about, the farmer's market? Like, who do you see picking it up to?
Well, it's like in New England, there's definitely like farms that like try to distinguish themselves as having like, I guess what you would call like heritage cow breed, or like cows who have a particular like actual ancestry to a certain subgroup of cows in Europe. But that also the milk that I've seen marketed by those farms is also like claiming to have different kinds of impacts on like your gut, and like carry different hormones than like whatever like generic, mainstream got milk you're drinking. And so it's like a combination of both like weird sort of like, this is about ancestry and heritage and like the health of that ancestry, but also like distinguishing itself from the kind of mass like agriculturally produced milk. So I don't know that much about it.
No, but you're right, because I do see that like certain breeds of milk or cattle are more healthy for you. And that gets marketed in China now. So in China, you can go to the grocery store and buy milk that is sourced from a particular heritage breed. And this is partly because a lot of Chinese people think they're lactose intolerant. So they'll go and pay a premium for a Vermont, I can't remember, Guernsey, I think is one of these breeds. But I just, I think it's, these breeds have like different hormone, and different, better proteins for you, right? So if this is like the picture, the reality in the past, and people presumably could digest this milk, what are the implications of that fact for something like lactase persistence as a evolutionary kind of question? Yeah. Sorry, I meant to, you had a question, I didn't want to.
I did. I was kind of going to go way off to another side, which is talking a little bit about sourcing. But what I'm interested in, like, white nationalist discourse in as much as it constitutes like the other than human. And I'm just fascinated because Stormfront is also this place for like ancient aliens and lots of other conspiracies. So I'm curious about the intersection here between like the constitution of other races as other than human and the tracing of the Aryan race as like being like superior to humanness, and like if there is any intersection here.
Yeah, because you can't just have the Aryan become like defined in a vacuum to the exclusion of all the other races, right? So something else must be happening with, so I know this is kind of controversial, but I think white nationalists are not the fringe. I think they're in the same mix with everyone else, and they're all, they're non-white others who are also kind of caught up, you know, in trying to kind of use ancestry to re-identify the boundaries of who they, you know, where they belong and who they belong with. So to your point, I think that would be a really interesting way to think about the intersections and the overlaps in the discourse. I mean, someone could do like probably a discourse analysis on Reddit and find all these subgroups that are kind of having these kind of conversations. But yeah, I think, you know, there's a website called American Renaissance, and it's a white nationalist website, but they post all scientific studies, a lot of anthropology too, actually, academic papers. And so there's a lot of, like, they're not ignorant, ignoble people. Like, they're not like the deplorables, right? They're really sophisticated in how they sort of parse this data. I mean, often to what they want to know and in a very biased way, but they know they have the literacy to do this. So to kind of allocate them, you know, kind of identify or slot them into a fringe, I think might be a bias on our own part as researchers.
Very quickly.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much for this talk. This was sort of an interesting segue into a question I had, which was, you know, how much disagreement in these white supremacist online spaces is there about milk consumption, and how do they negotiate with perhaps a personal inability to digest dairy, if you've ever seen such a thing?
Yeah, so that thread I was on, it was all about that. Individuals kind of feeling injured in some ways for not being able to digest milk, and almost like in a confessional way, sharing that with others. And then you can see others trying to like help them repair that identity by saying, oh, well, you know, if your haplotype is this, then it still means you're white, right? So there's a way so there's a lot of like, it's almost like there's like an element of care, language of care that is very much embedded in these threads. It's very weird.
Thank you so much.